And we're back with Marc Surdyka. How's it going, Marc?
It's going well, Chris. Thanks for having me back on.
Of course, yeah, we've had, I feel like, more frequent episodes together, which is great. I love talking to you. We got our matching E3 hoodies. If anyone's watching the YouTube channel, it's chilly where we're both living. So, yeah, we're all cozy and ready to rock. So, the goal for today is to provide more context into what is the value of providing a home exercise program. What are maybe more beneficial ways to go about laying it out, discussing it with patients, and progressing. So there's kind of six common mistakes that I think I've seen over the past few years, or that I've seen from patients that come in and bring in their other HEPs that they've done in the past. And I kind of want to go down the list. Before I go into number one, do you have any initial thoughts, anything to add from what I just mentioned, Marc?
Can you just set the scene for people? So, what's the environment that you're talking about? What's the patient population? Just to give a little bit more context about these points that you're going to discuss.
Yeah. So typically in the outpatient orthopedic or outpatient sports medicine setting, you'll have an initial evaluation with a patient, and it's very common practice to print out or provide some type of home exercise program for this individual going into their kind of self-management or home-based exercise moving forward or in between visits in the clinic. And we're going to chat about those interactions or those type of environments where it's primarily orthopedic and sports based. Typically, we're giving it early on, and that's kind of the surrounding context. Anything else you feel like I should add to that, Marc?
Yeah, and is this just the general population of adults? So it could be anyone from 18 to 90 or 100, and not necessarily a professional athlete or a college athlete, or it could be like, what are you thinking there?
Yeah, we could maybe touch on some of the more specialized populations, but I think for the majority of today's conversation in the general context, it's going to be more of the general population, middle age to older adult, that's coming in with either an acute injury or persistent injury, but maybe at least for now, we exclude some of these professional athletes or like really high return to sport settings or individuals. So let's go into mistake number one. We're going to go through six, but I want to provide kind of like a common mistake and maybe how we can do better. So the first one, prescribing an absurd amount of exercises or activities. This I see very commonly when other patients have brought in their prior home exercise programs from other therapists or other encounters in the past few years, where they're given dozens potentially of different exercises. And it's so overwhelming, one, to see as the therapist to know, like, are they actually doing this? How long is this taking? It's so much, and probably such a long time, such a long kind of investment for someone to do throughout the week. I think that's a really common mistake where the provider is just giving so much at the beginning. And I think the common example is, I kind of gave two examples, but this can be really can go in a variety of directions. But let's say someone's coming in with rotator cuff related shoulder pain or patellofemoral pain, and you do an initial evaluation. You want to set them up with an exercise plan. And for the shoulder, you end up giving 10 different exercise variations, maybe some active range of motion, maybe some band assisted activities or band resisted activities. And these kind of compile up to, by the time you're done creating it, you have 10 plus exercises. And that, I think, one, we need to question, is that necessary during these kind of first few interactions? Do they need that many activities in between sessions of care? Is it going to be sustainable for them to actually follow through with all of those? And if we were to reduce them to 3 to 5 different meaningful activities, are we losing progress, or is that less valuable than doing twice or three times as many activities? So I think in this example, simplicity is key, and narrowing down what truly is essential, as opposed to throwing a lot of things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And I've discussed this with patients of, we're going to start relatively simple and minimal, because if we do have a flare up, or if something ends up being a little bit too much, I don't want us to have 10 different variables and 10 different exercises, because we may not know what it is. And generally I get like a head nod or an agreement with that. And there's very rarely pushback when I'm starting more conservative or starting more minimal, and then kind of building and expanding from there. You have anything to add or thoughts with this kind of first mistake of just too many activities, too many exercises to begin with?
I liked your point at the end about with less options, you're better able to understand how a person responds. Like you said, if you give 10 things and something gets better, something gets worse, it is hard to determine what was the thing that helped or hurt. And then, yeah, when you give too many options initially, it's probably ineffective from a lifestyle perspective. If you have a parent with a full-time job and they have other obligations, and you're asking them to do an hour's worth of exercises every single day, that might not just be realistic for them to fit into their life. And then if they feel overwhelmed, they might not do the exercises at all. So they have a list of 10, they feel overwhelmed by the 10. Instead of picking out a few to do, they say, well, I need to do them all, but I don't have time to do them all, so I'm going to do none of them. And that, can backfire. And we'll probably get into that a little bit more too. And I think we'll also get into probably just the ineffectiveness of that many exercises. If somebody's doing 10 exercises, they're probably not doing any of those exercises very well, in the sense that like the adaptations or the goals that you want to achieve from that many exercises just aren't, it's probably not going to happen, because the intensity isn't great enough, or the rest times aren't long enough, just because they're trying to do so much in whatever time that they have available. So you mentioned 3 to 5 like exercises or activities. Is that your, I don't want to call it a magic number because there is no magic number, but is that your happy place, like the magic number for you somewhere in there, or is it very dependable on the person?
Yeah, it's not a magic number, and I think it's very dependable. When I said 3 to 5, I think it just gives an initial idea of not too many and maybe not too little. But I would say a lot of times I do less than that, maybe like even 1 to 3. And it is context and patient and situation dependent, but very rarely am I doing much more than 5. And there may be time where we build upon those 5, or we kind of subtract some initially and then kind of add from there, or add alternating A and B days that they're doing on their own. But yeah, I don't think there is a specific like hard cutoff, but I think it's this general rule of questioning yourself. Is this too many activities? Can I justify why I'm implementing each one into the plan? And a lot of times there's some redundancy, and this is going to be one of the other mistakes, but sometimes it's just unnecessary to add kind of multiple layered similar activities as opposed to simplifying it. And another example is if someone's coming in and they've had this kind of habit of doing these prior home exercise plans that they've been prescribed, and they either really enjoy or have felt like this has been a good part of their prior or current routine, I may not even add anything to what they've already been prescribed. But if they're showing me 30 different activities, I may try to provide recommendations of, okay, this is already what you're doing. I don't want to add anything to this, but let's take maybe half of those or a third of those and really prioritize them. Not to say that you can't do any of the others, but from our interaction and this kind of starting point of care, let's chunk and really like focus on these. And then all the others, if you want to continue it, you can. But there are contexts where I'm really not adding anything new because they are already doing so much that they've done in the past.
What do you say to the person who asks for more exercises after you've only prescribed 3 exercises or 4 exercises?
Yeah, I'll typically kind of reassure them that since this is our initial interaction or it's only been a few visits, I would set that expectation that we will add over time, but it kind of goes or circles back to I want to make sure that your symptoms are stable as we introduce a few activities. And if things go well between now and when I see you in a few days or in a week, then I'm more than happy to build upon this plan. But for right now, let's just stick with this. And rarely is there like hard pushback on them demanding more activities within that session because I'll kind of lead it into this will occur most likely, we'll add over time. But for right now, let's kind of remain minimal and conservative. And if things go well, I'm more than happy to build upon this. Yeah.
And for people listening, communication is really key here because if somebody does come in, if there are physical therapists listening and they've worked for longer than 3 months, probably they've had this experience where this older individual does come in with this packet of exercises, and you can just have a conversation with them and ask, how often are you doing these exercises? Do you find them valuable? Which ones are your favorite? Which ones do you not like to do? And they might say, yeah, like I enjoy including 5 exercises as part of my morning routine, and I do it right when I wake up in the morning. But I really don't like this one, and I don't really know if it's helping me at all. But I've been doing it because it was prescribed to me 2 years ago. And as we have a conversation and say, hey, well, do you want to get rid of this, or you're not really doing anything else that mimics this movement? Do you want to find an alternative? So it is you have to have the time to be able to do that, obviously, but walking through that, and that can be a multiple visit process where maybe you trim what's unnecessary, add what's helpful, and then work with the patient to figure out what's going to be best for them.
Yeah, I agree. This second point, I touched on it a little bit, and they kind of build on each other, 1 and 2. But number 2, prescribe overly redundant exercises within a home exercise plan. This can also contribute to why there's too many activities. The example that I'm initially thought of is someone is trying to improve an individual's tolerance or range of motion or strength to shoulder external rotation, and they give them 5 different shoulder ER based activities: sideline, dumbbell shoulder external rotation, standing band resisted, elbow on knee external rotation, different banded isometrics. And 1, it's a ton of activities. And 2, they're all essentially the same, maybe slight change in position, maybe slight change in load or the modality or the implement utilized, but they're very redundant. And to Mark's point earlier of if there's this many activities, 1, are we getting a sufficient enough stimulus with each one, or are you just kind of going through the motions? And if you are pushing these activities closer to, let's say, failure or to a more stimulating repetition or difficulty range, then you're going to be toasted if you do like 5 different shoulder ER variations. And this can go for, if you're trying to target the knee extensor musculature or the tissues of training the quads, and you do 5 different really intense quad variations, that person's just going to be toasted. And it's not realistic to add in that many and that much redundancy. Maybe there's some situations where we want to build on a few activities, but sometimes maybe patients aren't aware, and this is the provider's fault for not like saying, okay, we're progressing beyond this isometric variation and we're going to go on to this new activity. A lot of times they may not be aware. And so even though the therapist assumes that they're going to progress, the patient may keep in the prior exercise, and they're just kind of like growing this redundant exercise base for the same tissues or the same positions. You have any thoughts there, Mark?
I definitely think the training examples are easiest for people to relate to. Like you said, with the quads, people will do the leg press and then a squat and then a split squat and then a goblet. They'll do 4 different squatting variations and they're all accomplishing pretty similar things. Maybe there's slight differences there. Or, someone who does, chest on Monday, they're doing a bench press and then a flat dumbbell press and then, very similar exercises. And actually you could include that in your education. Like, let's say you get a recreational lifter or a gym goer and they go, hey, I have this anterior shoulder pain on my chest day. I'm not sure why. Here are the exercises that I'm doing. We could say, hey, well, you know what? You're actually kind of repeating yourself with these 5 exercises. Why don't you remove a few of them? Maybe you add in a slightly different variation. So you can actually work that into their meaningful activities as well, if that works. And the other thing I would say is that the movements don't have to mimic one another for them to be redundant in the sense of what musculature or tissues that they're working. So you do have to be mindful of that. So somebody comes in, they have, tennis elbow, this lateral elbow tendinopathy, and you think, well, I'm going to give them wrist extension, grip, supination, and a few different things. And while maybe those are all slightly different movements, there is some redundancy in the musculature that's being affected, and that could impact their symptoms. So it could be one of those things that you just say, hey, we're just going to start with resisted wrist extension because that's all you can tolerate right now. And then next time you come in, we'll try to throw in, this grip or this resisted supination. Obviously, it's going to vary between people, but that's something to keep in mind as well, is that the exercises might be different and they are different stimuli, but they could affect overlapping tissues that you might have to keep in mind when prescribing exercises.
Yeah, good point. And to that example of just a normal kind of training session, I had this conversation with an E3 consult a few weeks ago. This individual was having anterior shoulder pain, and I asked him to outline what his upper body sessions look like. He would start off with a warm-up of 100 push-ups, then do flat dumbbell press, incline dumbbell press, decline dumbbell press, flat machine press, incline machine press, decline machine press. And I asked him, or I just kind of alluded to the fact that that's a lot of exercises and a lot of volume for the chest and the shoulders. Is there a reason you chose that many activities in one session? And they really didn't have a great answer. They just said they like exercising. And I brought up the idea of spacing out the volume throughout the week, noting that a lot of these activities are kind of accomplishing the same goal and the same tissues, that it may be more beneficial to over the week spread this out and or decrease some of the volumes. And that can also occur in just a interaction with a patient in the clinic of hearing what their typical week looks like, understanding if they are training on their own or they're exercising and they're already doing some of the things that you may want to prescribe. That's also super valuable to know what does a typical training week or exercise or activity week look like for them. And the redundancy may be in the fact that you're only prescribing a limited number of exercises, but it's redundant because they're already doing this and you didn't ask, you didn't dive into knowing that they're already performing these activities. And now they're just layering it on without you kind of being aware of it. Point number 3, or mistake number 3, prescribing only low-level, low-load activities without a plan for progression. I think there's arguments to be made that not each rehab or not each injury or kind of experience of pain, things have to be at all times progressive in the sense of it has to be more load over time or more intensity or more volume. But in a lot of musculoskeletal instances or post-operatively, there needs to be an appropriate stimulus and progressing that stimulus over time to get back to someone needs to do or wants to do. And I think very commonly, this home exercise program, they're starting very low level. And for some individuals in some circumstances, it makes sense. And it's always finding that appropriate entry point. But over the course of multiple weeks or months, that plan never gets progressed. And the person is doing the same, table-based activities or body weight or super light loaded exercises in the clinic and or on their own. And maybe it still feels good for them. It's getting them moving, but it's really not pushing the needle in the right direction or in maybe like the most efficient means or manner, because there's really no like progressive overload in a sense. And uh, I do think a lot of instances it's very normal and okay to start with these low level exercises, but checking back in on, is this patient describing that this activity is now too easy, or their symptoms are now tolerable enough to where we can increase whatever it is we want to increase or feel like we need to increase, and checking in on that daily or weekly to make sure that this plan is progressive and that we're not just week 1 doing the same activities at home versus week 12. Any things to add there, Mark?
Yeah. So to me, you're describing something that's a little bit more goal oriented, in not a goal of patient will perform 3 exercises every other day, but goal oriented in the sense of you're trying to have them push themselves a bit, and then maybe there are some objective markers of progress. They went up from 5 pounds to 10 pounds to 15 pounds. And I know you were kind of arguing the other side a little bit, but I'll ask you this anyway for people who might have this thought process, is that how we prescribe exercises for training, strength, hypertrophy, just general performance is different than pain, because we can't always correlate improvements in those other adaptations, strength, hypertrophy, performance, whatever, with improvements in pain. So how do we argue that? Like, let's say we'll go back to the patellofemoral pain example. In our minds, we might say the idea is that we're going to get them to be able to tolerate more force through the knee extensor mechanism, right? And we're going to do this by progressing their squats and their leg extensions. And by doing this, hopefully the patellofemoral joint is able to tolerate greater forces and their recovery is going to be better. But we know that those outcomes don't always correlate. So yeah, do you see an argument for the other side where it's like, hey, obviously some of those older individuals who have those packets of exercises did get better, and there was no progressive overload. They weren't probably pushing to failure. So how do we square that circle?
Yeah, it's super messy. And one, I think it's not establishing this arbitrary objective measure that may not be valuable to that individual, and basing your care off of it. So let's say it is this older adult with patellofemoral pain or symptomatic knee osteoarthritis, and you think that they just need to get stronger, and goblet squatting with 35 pounds for 3 sets of 10 will be enough, and we need to move in that direction. Pain is super messy. Symptoms can be volatile. There's a lot of other systemic factors, but if you're listening to the patient and understanding that they may have functional limitations, whether it is difficulty just with daily transitions of getting up and out of a chair or in and out of their car, or they want to go for longer walks, or they want to be able to tolerate squatting and picking up grandkids, or these things that do have force and positional and time requirements, it's having that discussion with the patient saying, I can't guarantee that all of your symptoms are going to substantially improve or completely go away if we get you stronger. But what you're describing to me are some of the things you want to get back to. We do need to kind of progressively get you there. And this is your starting point. And these are some of the activities or the positions or the loads that I think will help us kind of bridge that gap. And it's being honest with getting you from A to Z from an exercise or load may not be the cure-all for your symptoms, but if you're okay with some level of discomfort, if you can get back to the valuable things, then that's what we're using as kind of the narrative and the plan to go through this plan or through this exercise routine, not instilling this sense of this is directly correlated with this. If we improve this strength, your knee pain will drastically disappear or be gone forever. That's how I think about it. That's how I kind of discuss it. Do you have any pushback or things you would add to that?
I think at the very least, there should be some rationale to your exercise prescription. There should be some form of plan in place while understanding that that plan needs to be flexible and you need to be adaptable. The patient's probably going to be a little bit adaptable because you're going to have to figure out what is and isn't working, whether that's with exercise selection, parameters, etc. And I've mentioned this before, but I mentored orthopedic physical therapy residents for a very long time, and they're new grads, and oftentimes every day's exercise selection would be different. It was kind of a spur of the moment. Hey, let's do this exercise today, and let's try this exercise today. And oh, how are your symptoms feeling? Let's try out this movement. And to me, it was just very random, and there didn't seem to be a lot of rationale underpinning that exercise selection other than maybe what the person was reporting at that very moment. And that's fine. That's something that you kind of learn and navigate through. But every once in a while, trying to take a step back and saying, okay, where is this person starting? What do they want to try to get back to? How might I help them do that to the best of my ability? And there still is going to be, some of that spontaneity with exercise prescription, but it's just being a little bit more thoughtful in that prescription.
Okay, next one, prescribing activities that a patient does not feel comfortable performing on their own or performing independently. So there can be instances where you've maybe had them perform this exercise in the clinic once or twice, or you're describing it and they actually have yet to do it, but you assume or you implement or recommend they do this on their own. There may be a lot of times patients are fearful of doing this exercise without a provider or someone guiding them through it in person or watching them or providing feedback, or they may not even have the adequate resources to do it. But a lot of times I think it goes back to their own sense of confidence and competence with the movement or with an activity. And a lot of times that's the value of physical therapy in clinic or in person, is they're trusting the provider and they have this sense of confidence in the clinic, but making sure that they have that same sense of a plan or comfortability performing this on their own before just assuming they'll do it. So if it's a movement or an activity or an exercise that they're either fearful of or cautious, but ultimately it's something they want to get back to, or like we just discussed, something that we think will kind of get them to where they want to get back to, confirming that they feel okay with this plan, that they feel comfortable doing this on their own. And if there is pushback or they are concerned, having that discussion of, well, what things are you worried about? What do you feel like is a barrier? How can we help get you to the point where you do feel comfortable? Do we want to hold off on this until we get a few more reps in the clinic, and then we kind of guide you to start doing this on your own? And it's just not the assumption of adding an activity because you've tried it in the clinic, confirming that, okay, this is my recommendation for what we're going to do on your own or between now and next visit. Does that feel realistic, or do you have any questions or concerns? And yeah, I think there can be a lot of times where they're just like, well, what happens if I have symptoms, or what happens if my technique is wrong? And having those discussions before they end up leaving, that may kind of calm their initial nerves or sense of worry about now doing this thing that they were potentially fearful of on their own. Anything there, Mark?
Yeah, I think excessive cueing can be an issue here, especially if you're doing excessive cueing over 10 exercises. And an example would be, person comes in first visit, you've already given them 9 exercises, all with lots of cues. The 10th exercise is a forward step down and you're saying, okay, create the short foot, maintain your arch. Your knee's going to go over your second toe. You're going to externally rotate your femur. You're going to maintain a level pelvis. Your eyes are going to be straight ahead. You're going to very gently tap your heel, and there's 10 cues for them to try to remember what this one exercise. You're giving manual feedback. There's a mirror in front of them. And then they're trying to recreate this at home. And it's just it's probably not necessary, but it's also not feasible along with all of the other exercises that they're doing. So I think you have to be careful with that as well, where you might think, hey, they did it exactly how I want them to do in the clinic. And then maybe they feel a little bit lost at home because of the discrepancy there between the amount of feedback that they're getting at home versus the amount that they're given in the clinic.
Yeah, to that point, I've noticed that with individuals where they've worked with other professionals or other coaches or trainers, and they're so used to this kind of constant verbal cueing or adjustment, and they almost get like paranoid if I'm too quiet. And it's kind of changing that belief of, if I'm quiet, this means that we don't need to change anything. You can continue moving forward, and not constantly having to change the exercise or change the position or feel like they're doing something wrong. And yeah, I think a lot of that is apparent with the verbal cueing, and then with the home exercise prescription, what's written or what's verbally stated. A lot of times the sheet that's given to someone, let's say it's as simple as like a clamshell or a bridge or a bodyweight squat, there can be like 5 different cues of how to set this up and how to do it. And again, is the patient actually going to do it, or are they like fearful that they're going to miss a step or they're going to injure themselves? And I think that becomes a big like freeze for someone, or sense of anxiety, because they feel like there has to be this perfect way to execute an activity. That if you don't have that conversation that, hey, there's a lot of ways to experiment with this on your own. We've seen you do it in the clinic. I feel very comfortable with you and how you're performing it now. Do you have any questions before we start to implement this at home on your technique, or on if you do have symptoms, and really setting them up for you're good to go. And if you do have things that pop up, I'll see you in a few days or a week or so, and we can have a discussion on how do we tweak this, or something did pop up. But yeah, I think what you said there, Mark, it also made me think of something that I didn't have initially in this outline, but different ways to provide the plan, like different actual resources. So the most common is this printout of HEP to go, or these other platforms where you just type in activities. It gives these kind of auto-generated cues and sets and reps, and you give it to them. But I know a lot of patients where their preference and comfortability is they want you to take their phone and they want you to film you performing the activity, and they want to like rewatch themselves doing it at their home, or with you kind of giving 1 or 2 verbal cues as you're filming it. Or my general preference is a follow-up email with kind of specific prescriptions and recommendations and video links to each activity, so that I can go and watch it on YouTube with maybe some cueing input in the audio or whatever it is. But I think that's also super beneficial to know, what does a patient prefer? A lot of times it's not a hard copy. Sometimes it's a video of themselves doing it. Sometimes it's just kind of a written outline or YouTube videos. I think that also helps with letting them understand that I don't have to have this all in my head or on a sheet of paper. I can visually see myself doing it, or I can watch a YouTube video. And that can also help with like the sustainability and like actual integrative nature of doing it by themselves.
Yeah, we've all had the experience where we've prescribed an exercise, patient comes back, we ask them to show us how they're doing it, and then it's something completely different, and you're like, not the exercise I showed you, but I like it. And that's, probably the fault of the therapist. I do like the video idea of like taking the person's camera, because it is really easy. Take the camera, you film them, you can give them some cues, you can give them the parameters. Hey, I want you to do 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 10 of these, or if the patient doesn't feel comfortable doing that, they can film you doing it. And it's the same idea of, okay, I'm going to show you how to do the squat. This is kind of what I want you to look for when you do it on your own. And then these are the sets and reps. And yeah, like there are so many different avenues for prescribing exercises now. We've probably talked about it on the podcast. We have a free exercise library on YouTube that 1,000, 2,000 exercises, something like that, where it's written and kind of verbal cues on there. So a lot of options.
Yeah, to an example, earlier this week on Tuesday, I had an initial eval with a 15-year-old female post-op ACL about a week out. Her and her mom were in the room, and I'm discussing these big priorities, first few days, first few weeks. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of pain and concern and all these things that come immediately post-operatively, especially with the first kind of major surgery. And I'm verbally reiterating these things, discussing them multiple times, having her kind of relay the information back to me, kind of this talk back. But I'm also reassuring them and saying, hey, everything that we covered today and all the things that I really want you to prioritize at home, I'm going to send your mom a follow-up email exactly describing what I want us to do between now and next visit. I'm going to have videos of the activities we covered so you feel comfortable and you don't feel like you have to like manage all this in your head or remember it all. And I think that also kind of makes people feel like they can kind of relax in a session, as opposed to thinking, how do I memorize or remember all this as he's talking to me and I'm super nervous or in a ton of pain. Like, it's just reassuring to know that there's going to be another place for them to refer back to this information, and all of what my provider is describing to me, there's going to be somewhere that I can refer back to it, as opposed to just trying to memorize it.
And with that being said, right now we're speaking about home exercise programs from the perspective of what's easiest and most convenient and helpful for the patient. But we understand that physical therapists themselves and other clinicians have a lot on their plate as it is. And maybe people aren't in a position, Chris, to do exactly what you do, where you follow up with this long email. Like, they're still trying to catch up at notes at the end of the day. And if they were to send emails to every patient, they wouldn't be having dinner or, spending time with family. So there are alternatives. Like, I'm not in a clinic at the moment, but when I was, oftentimes I get a sheet of paper, I'd have a clipboard, I'd write some things down on that sheet of paper, and you could hand the person that sheet of paper, but everything's so digital nowadays. You can say, hey, take a picture of this. And they just take a picture of, these are the 3 things that I want you to do. These are the 3 exercises I want you to do. You've already recorded them. Now I've written it down on this piece of paper. Just take a picture of this. Now you have those 3 videos of those exercises, and you have these goals written down, and it's right on your phone, right? So then just back to back to back in their photo album on their phone, they have the exercises and the goals and the things that you want them to do. So that's an option also if, you don't have the ability to send this lengthy email with linked exercises at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a great point. I acknowledge that there's a lot of settings where you're just trying to stay above water. What can be helpful in those instances is if someone has prior emails on similar injuries or there's similar recommendations. If you are in a high enough volume clinic, you're probably going to see a lot of these repeat scenarios where a lot of times the exercise prescription or the home plan is relatively similar, and you maybe have some templates within prior emails or in like a drive where you can just kind of copy and paste, maybe make a few tweaks, but you don't have to start everything from scratch. Another kind of add on to what you said there, Mark, with kind of writing it down or videotaping it. I think I've talked about this in other episodes, but having a sheet of paper and more looking at a typical week for an individual and trying to just make things fit into their schedule and just writing out, okay, this is Monday through Sunday. Let's discuss what is feasible for you. Of maybe it's not these like prescriptive exercises within kind of a home plan, more of just general physical activity. these are the days you're saying you're available. Let's actually write this out. I'm going to give you kind of a weekly calendar or schedule on this paper that we're looking at. And this is when we're both agreeing that makes sense for you to try to develop this habit of going to the gym or going for a walk or whatever it is. And that can be done in the session as opposed to this lengthy email kind of summary follow-up.
Yeah. And use our YouTube videos. Like, you don't have to prescribe every exercise that we prescribe. You don't have to agree with everything that we say in the YouTube videos. But if there's a 5-minute section that really resonates with your beliefs and what you want the patient to hear, say, hey, just to reiterate, check out this YouTube video from here to here. Or, hey, this YouTube video has 2 of the exercises that I want you to do, and it gives some cues on how to progress or regress or alternatives. Like, that's what that's there for, especially for some of the things that aren't necessarily exercise based, right? So we have a video, Goldilocks principle of rehab, just about trying to find your tolerable level of activity. And that can be a lengthy conversation to have with the patient. And maybe you don't have time for that long conversation, or maybe you do, but you don't have time for this long email. Just say, hey, just to reiterate some of what we talked about, here's a nice video that kind of summarizes what was said today.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've done that for, they're learning about their condition for the first time, and I want to provide just more context, or just a further resource. And, maybe it's frozen shoulder and they're just trying to get a grasp of what it is and management strategies. And it's adding that resource of, here's a great YouTube video with what it is, how to manage it, general timelines, etc. Or more specifically, we're working on someone's range of motion. We're working on knee extension. I'm trying to get them back to a certain number. We have a few activities in the clinic and at home, but I send them, the knee extension range of motion video or knee flexion or whatever it is, and say, these are a few things we tried. You can watch this video if you want to explore other positions to work on it, improving this range of motion. Okay, the last one I had is prescribing an overly rigid plan. And I think we've alluded to this and circled back to it in the past. But if you are dead set on this being the ideal routine or exercise program for an individual, but quickly the individual is describing it's not realistic for their schedule, they're having flare up of symptoms, they don't like these exercises, there's so many different things. But if you only believe that this is the way to go through their rehab or through the things on their own, even though there's pushback from the patient, that's not a really successful interaction or plan of care. So being very flexible and honest and humble with yourself as a provider, knowing that there's probably going to be adjustments for a variety of reasons, whether it's the time commitment, whether it's the symptoms, whether things are too easy, too hard, they don't have access to them, whatever it is. I a lot of times will discuss in the initial evaluation, this is going to be our starting point. There's going to be potentially some trial and error, and some things we add, we may realize it's too much or it's too little. And we're going to have kind of experiment and trial and error over the next few visits and some of the things we add at the house. So it's caveating early on that this is not set in stone. This is not overly rigid. There's going to be some like fluidity to this process. And that is alleviating to the therapist, one, to give that, and then also to the patient, knowing that, oh, thank God, if this isn't going well, that fortunately my therapist is going to come up with other options, or we're going to have another discussion of how do we self-adjust. So yeah, I think a big thing is just not assuming that the plan you initially create is going to be the same plan the next week or 2 weeks or whatever it is. What are your thoughts, Mark?
I think one of the hardest things that, we've done is with the programs that we have and the exercise plans that we make in YouTube videos, trying to encompass as many people as possible. Some people do like very prescriptive exercise plans, and hopefully they come to realize that being overly prescriptive, either for rehab or training, isn't always necessary, right? It's nice to have some flexibility depending on schedule, symptoms, function, etc. But yeah, trying to encompass as many people as possible has been a real challenge, and try not to make things too rigid and trying to take some of these topics that we've talked about into account have been hard, because let's say, an individual with an ACL reconstruction, overall, the plan is going to be similar, right? You're going to want them to get back to running and then cutting and then getting back to their sport. But maybe this person doesn't want to get, one person doesn't want to get back to level one sport and the other person does. So the exercise selection might be similar throughout, but the timing might be a little bit different. The intensity might be a little bit different. And so I've definitely gotten better with that. If you've watched some of the newer YouTube videos versus the older ones, trying to have flexibility with the plan of, okay, if you want the bare minimum, here are probably some exercise options that you can do. If you want more, here are, some other exercise options that you can do based on your goals. You can vary your sets and your repetitions. It's also going to depend on your recreational activities and the things that you're doing outside of your traditional, quote unquote rehab. So yeah, it's definitely been a challenge trying to do that.
Yeah, that reminded me of finishing up a long-term remote client through E3, post patellar tendon repair, got him back to skiing, worked with him for about year and a half. His big request right before we kind of stopped services or this kind of monthly coaching, he wanted to know, well, a year down the road, 5 years down the road, how do I feel like I can still progress or have a plan? And so I sent him an email summary of distilling down, how do you plug and play and mix and match a lower body plan, not being overly rigid, but having some like framework and skeleton. So I essentially described, like, my recommendation is you try to keep in 2 lower body days per week. Let's have one day be kind of a primary squat day, one day be a primary hinge. We want to have still some kind of like speed and like velocity elements on the front end. Here's a variety of activities of how to go about that. Here's a variety of durations or rep ranges. We want a variety of kind of accessory or isolated based tasks within this rep range or within these sets. Here's a variety of exercises. It's totally up to you of which one you choose. Rock and roll with it for a period of a few weeks or a few months. Once you feel like you've plateaued, you're kind of psychologically ready to move on, choose another option. And you can kind of go through this list almost infinitely and kind of circle back. And it's providing like enough structure to where there's confidence of how to move forward, but enough flexibility for them to adjust over multiple weeks, months, years, etc.
Yeah, it's hard because, like, that example, if we throw some caveats in there, might work for like 90% of people, meaning that, hey, here's one caveat. If you don't have that much time, only do 3 exercises on each leg day instead of 5. Hey, you can't barbell back squat for whatever reason. Here's 4 alternatives or regressions. Hey, you also need to work on your knee flexion range of motion. Here's a possibility for you to work on. So it's trying to account for every single possibility or variability, which is impossible to do. But now we're kind of getting outside of the realm of N of one person in front of you individualization. But it's just something that I've had to work on over the years.
Sure. I realized I skipped over one, and this will probably be our final mistake or thing to discuss: prescribing activities requiring resources that a patient doesn't have access to. And I think a huge component of the initial interaction or the first few interactions with a patient is understanding, 1, what they want to get back to, 2, what they enjoy and have had positive experiences with in the past, and what they really don't like or don't want to do. What does a typical week or day look like for them, and how throughout a week they can fit XYZ exercise or workout into their plan, and what are the resources that they have available. And just assuming that someone has access to a gym and you want to prescribe a variety of machines to start loading their lower body, but they don't like going to the gym, they don't feel comfortable, they don't have the money, they don't have the time or the resources, that's not helpful for them. And they're definitely not going to do it. So it's discussing what have they done in the past, or what are they currently doing, and what do they have access to, and then creating that routine and that plan around all of these factors and variables, so that one, they enjoy it, two, it's meaningful and valuable and they will actually do it, and that they have consistency with it because they have access to these things. And if that's as simple as doing like body weight based activities at the house, because that's where they feel the most comfortable starting, they don't have any equipment at the home, we can get kind of enough of a stimulus with those things. And maybe over time we suggest, hey, here are some things that you can add at the house, or if you're ever interested in going to a gym or doing these classes, here's some like resources, here are some thoughts. But meeting someone with where they're at, time wise, resource wise, enjoyment wise, I think is huge.
Yeah, optimal, I don't know if it doesn't exist, but it's a ever moving target. Like someone might have access to the gym and they might say, well, I don't use it right now, but now that I'm coming to rehab and we're doing leg extensions in the clinic, I'd like to do that at the gym. And so you say, okay, twice a week. Why don't we'll get to the gym. You said you can do it. And you do leg extensions at the gym twice a week. And they come back the next week and they go, I didn't make it to the gym this week. And you go, okay, that's fine. Let's try to do it once this week. And, they come back next week and they didn't make it again, but they're really adamant about, getting to the gym and doing leg extensions because, in their mind, it's the most optimal thing to do for their quads. But, after a couple of weeks of that, you might just say, you know what, it's okay. If you can eventually get into the gym because you have access to the gym and it fits your schedule, great. But for right now, let's just do wall sits at home, or we'll do, banded leg extensions at home. Like let's do what's going to get done versus chasing, optimal, even if they might have that resource, just because it just doesn't, fit into their schedule, or for whatever reason, they don't get around to doing it.
Yeah. I had this conversation with a patient earlier this week in the clinic where there's just a ton of variables as to why she wasn't doing stuff on her own. And it was only our first follow-up visit, but we initially created a plan of let's go to the gym once or twice a week in between this visit and next. And she has a very hectic work schedule. She works at this big warehouse kind of fulfillment center, working 10-hour days. She recently got a divorce and she has to work a lot, and then she has to make all her food. And there's all these things that take up her time and energy, etc. And then she told me that she has to fly back to and from Mexico to take care of her mom, and how the initial plan that we had of trying to do something on a Sunday and on a Wednesday wasn't realistic. And we had that discussion earlier this week. And I said, well, we're already planning on exercising in the clinic one time per week, each time I see you. And for right now, with how busy your schedule is, this may be what's the most realistic. Like, you've slotted this into your schedule. We have this time availability. Let's take advantage of this. And then as things start to become a little bit less hectic after this season, going into the new year, you're describing that you're going to have a little bit more energy and time. Let's discuss, how do we add something on your own, maybe another day a week. But sometimes the most someone can do to start, or what they perceive that they can do, is what's done in clinic. And sometimes that's completely okay, because one, it's maybe the most realistic, and two, people a lot of times are starting at such a low level that even if you're seeing them once a week or twice a week, that may be enough of a stimulus or a frequency or an intensity that it still drives adaptation, or it dampens down some of their symptoms, that you can kind of let them relax and reassure them that, all right, if this is all we do this week, long term, we need to set up a plan, because we're not going to be interacting together. But for these period of a few weeks or a few months, let's just bank on like really being efficient and beneficial with these interactions. And then we can start to add stuff when it feels appropriate and realistic for you.
Yeah. And this point might fit somewhere else, but don't let optimal for the patient get in the way of their goals, meaning that if they think that doing, I'll go back to the leg extension example. They think doing leg extensions in the gym is optimal for them, but then it flares up their knee and they can't work out for another 6 or 7 days. So they don't do their exercises for a few days, but then they go back and they do leg extensions again. And this is like this reoccurring process. It'd be like, having a goal of losing weight. And so you decide to start running, but because you're so sore or because of the discomfort from running that first time, you're not able to run again for another week. And in reality, you'd be better off just walking every single day or, at first, and then building up your running. So same idea. If there's something that's kind of getting in the way of this optimal, spreading things out and just, finding what works is usually best.
All right. We covered a lot. We're almost at an hour. Any other final thoughts or things you feel like we didn't touch on that's worth discussing before we wrap it up?
No, you're offering mentoring now, right?
Yeah. So for students, new grads, clinicians that may want to chat about managing the reality of being a student or a new clinician and have questions about this specific topic of creating a home exercise program or diving into the research or discussing hard conversations with patients or with their professors, whatever it is. Yeah, we're offering through E3 one-off or kind of multiple mentorship calls, and whatever people find valuable to them, whether it's, just a one-off conversation or repeat calls over multiple months. Yeah, I am very excited to offer this for people because I had such great mentorship growing into being a young kind of clinician, being in grad school. So if anyone feels like that would be beneficial to them, you can either reach out to me directly, Chris at e3rehab.com, through my social media, or on the E3 website all the way down, there's a mentorship link that you can look at more information. But yeah, hopefully these conversations with me and Marc are helpful for you all, the other episodes. But if you want more of a kind of one-on-one intimate conversation about the specific concerns or questions or scenarios that you're trying to manage, and you don't feel like you have this consistent in-person mentor, we're here to kind of provide that to y'all. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Marc.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it's kind of nice because sometimes like this episode might feel a little theoretical for some people, right? It's okay. I understand that, but how do I apply that in practice? Or we're talking about exercise prescription, and you gave some examples of the plans that you created for consults. The nice thing about a mentorship is you can say, hey, this is the exercise plan that I created. This is what we did on this week. This is kind of how I structured it over the course of 3 months or 6 months. This was my rationale. This was the research that kind of drove that thought process, and that makes it a little bit more practical. It's almost like following a post-operative, guideline or something, or it just gives you a little bit more structure. And I think that can be helpful if sometimes you feel like, oh, this is nice information to know, but how do I apply it better in actual practice?
Totally. All right, Marc, we'll call it there. Hopefully this episode was useful. And if, again, y'all, whether it's the debunking topics or just specific conversations or topics you want me and Marc to discuss, let us know on Instagram and podcast comments, wherever you want. But we'll call it there. Thanks, Marc.
Peace.